Jason Lichty with the Broward County Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Preparing Florida for the Future, Opportunities for Resilience in Local Communities. First, before we go any farther, I just want to quickly orient any newcomers to the GoToWebinar platform to what you're seeing on your screen. Excuse me, 1 second. Becky, we're having looks like we're hitting a limit of attendees. I'm not sure what that's about. And unmute you, Becky. I don't know. It says we're not allowed to enter. Yeah. No one else is allowed to enter.
Let me see what I can do.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption, folks. Folks are not being allowed to enter the webinar, and of course we don't want that to happen. So anyway, back to the housekeeping. On the left, you should see the presentation slides. Presumably, you're seeing them right now. And on the right is the control panel, where you can select audio mode and ask questions in the question tab. Go farther here. So just zooming in a little bit on that control panel for a minute. In the audio panel, just highlighted there towards the top, you have the option to use the microphone and speakers on your computer or to connect to the audio via telephone. And then in the question box, you are able to submit questions to the panelists. We'll do our best to get through as many of those as we possibly can after they've given their presentations. I hope you'll bear with me if we run into any more technical glitches. Obviously, we've already run into one. I am personally new to administering these webinars, and I'll try not to crash everyone's computer, even though we may do that right here. As I mentioned, my name is Jason Lichty. And I'm with the Environmental Projects Coordinator with the Broward County Environmental Planning and Community Resilience Division. Also with me today here to help facilitate, potentially, is Dr. Jennifer Jurado, who is our Division Director. Both Dr. Jurado and I sit as the Broward County members of the Staff Steering Committee of the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact, which is the sponsor of today's webinar. As some of you may know, the Compact is a collective effort to address climate change undertaken by the 4 counties of Southeast Florida. It's Palm Beach, Broward, Miami-Dade, and Monroe counties, and many of the municipalities, businesses, nonprofit groups, academic institutions, state and federal agencies, and other organizations here in Southeast Florida. The Compact model has made a name for itself and has achieved national and international recognition. For more information about the Compact, please visit our website at www.southeastfloridaclimatecompact.org. I believe today may be actually our first large-scale public webinar ever, but it certainly will not be the last. I'd also like to extend a special thanks to one of the Compact's key nonprofit partners, the Institute for Sustainable Communities, for allowing us to borrow their webinar platform today. I specifically want to recognize Becky Weber, who's been an invaluable help in sorting out all the technical details, along with her colleagues Steve Adams, Nancy Schneider, and Elliot Bent. ISC does tremendously valuable work to help communities improve their environmental, economic, and social health, as well as their resilience. And I would encourage everyone watching to learn more about ISC at its website if you're not familiar with the organization. It's iscbt.org. So here's a rundown of today's presenters. The Honorable Kristin Jacobs, sitting here next to me, who is a member of the Florida House of Representatives. Margo Moehring with the Northeast Florida Regional Council. And Josh Sawislak with the White House Council on Environmental Quality. I'm going to provide a brief introduction for each of them, and then they'll make their presentations. After that, we'll take questions until we conclude at 2:30 Eastern Time. First up is Kristin Jacobs, who is a member of the Florida House, as I mentioned. She was elected in November 2014 to represent Florida's 96th district in northern Broward County. She was recently named Democratic Ranking Member of the Agriculture, Natural Resources and Appropriations Subcommittee. Oh, I'm getting messages, Becky, that no one's seeing any slides. Hold on. Oh, there we go. Maybe that's better. Sorry, folks. I didn't realize I hadn't done that. I told you there'd be technical problems. So prior to Representative Jacobs' election to the legislature, she served as Broward County Commissioner from 1998 until 2014 and as Broward County Mayor in 2005 and 2013. During her tenure on the County Commission, Representative Jacobs was renowned for her leadership on environmental and quality of life issues. She created several task forces focused on sustainability, including the Broward County Climate Change Task Force, Broward County Water Advisory Board, and the Coastal Oceans Task Force, which she currently chairs. In 2009, Representative Jacobs joined with leaders from 3 other counties to create the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Change Compact. In recognition of her leadership on climate issues, President Obama named her in November 2012 to the State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience, where she served as co-chair of the Built Systems subgroup, developing recommendations pertaining to America's infrastructure. Earlier, in 2011, Representative Jacobs was selected by the White House to serve as chair of the National Ocean Council's Governance Coordinating Committee, which advises President Obama on local government perspectives on ocean policy. Representative Jacobs is also a member of Smart Growth America's Local Leaders Council and an ICLEI Resilient Communities for America inaugural signatory. As Broward County Mayor, her achievements also included the Tri-County Compact, an agreement among Broward, Miami-Dade, and Palm Beach counties to work together as a region to accomplish mutual goals. She also celebrated the passage of Broward Complete Streets program and major advancements to Fort Lauderdale's WAVE streetcar project, both of which support sustainable transportation. Representative Jacobs' presentation today will cover her experiences on the Presidential Climate Task Force, some of the recommendations from the task force that may be of particular interest to local communities, and also some opportunities for promoting resilience in local communities that may arise during the upcoming session of the Florida Legislature. Then we'll hear from Margo Moehring. Ms. Moehring joined the staff of the Northeast Florida Regional Council as Director of Policy in January 2008. She led efforts to establish a 50-year vision for growth and development in the First Coast, completed an update to the regional plan informed by the vision, and staffed Regional Community Institute policy recommendations on sea level rise in Northeast Florida, an action item identified by the vision. Prior to joining the Regional Council and RCI, she was Chief of Strategic Planning at the City of Jacksonville Planning and Development Department. Before moving to Florida in 2000, Ms. Moehring was Executive Director of Strategic Planning with the New York City Department of Citywide Administrative Services, Division of Real Estate Services. She graduated from Jacksonville University and has a Master of Philosophy degree in Town Planning from University College London. Ms. Moehring is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and the Royal Town Planning Institute. In her presentation, Ms. Moehring will discuss the approach being taken in Northeast Florida to respond to climate and sea level rise challenges. As you'll see in here, the private sector is very heavily involved in the Northeast Florida efforts, which is a different model than the local government-led approach we've taken here in Southeast Florida. And finally, we'll turn to Josh Sawislak, who recently joined the White House Council on Environmental Quality as the Associate Director for Climate Preparedness. Prior to joining the Executive Office of the President, he served as a Senior Advisor to Housing and Urban Development Secretaries Julian Castro and Sean Donovan, focused on infrastructure and resilience at HUD and across government. Mr. Sawislak also led the development of the infrastructure recommendations for President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force and supported the President's State, Local, and Tribal Leaders Task Force on Climate Preparedness and Resilience. Prior to joining the Obama administration in 2013, he served in senior executive roles in both government and industry, leading efforts on infrastructure development, resilience, disaster recovery, transportation, and environmental planning. Mr. Sawislak is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and has spoken extensively on resilience and climate adaptation issues. During his presentation, he'll tell us about some of the federal efforts underway to respond to climate change and identify some tools and opportunities that the federal government is making available to local governments and other folks on the ground. And now, with no further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Representative Kristin Jacobs.
Well, good morning, or I guess it's afternoon, isn't it? Good afternoon, everyone. From warm and sunny South Florida, for those of you that are in colder parts of our state, it's lovely down here in Fort Lauderdale. Happy to be on the phone with you today and giving this webinar. I wanted to kind of just briefly flow through some of these early slides and tell you a little bit about the vulnerabilities in our state, much of which you all probably know, that what you may not know, that we are the 4th largest economy in the United States, but most of us have all heard our governor proclaim that now, as we are the 3rd most populous state in the nation, that anyone who lives outside of Florida ought to come live into Florida. So I think that number is going to continue to grow. And when we look at all of the ways in which the state is impacted and vulnerable, we certainly know that in the impacts of new people and new demands on our systems are also in our future for the 18 seaports that we have here in the state, as well as our transportation and trade systems, a very prominent service and tourism industry, and very important agricultural producer, and also known worldwide for our beautiful natural areas. Some of the hazards that we know have been coming our way and are continuing to come, albeit studies have shown us that the storms may not come in greater number, but are likely to be in greater severity. And outside the storms, our vulnerabilities include temperature extremes, severe wet and dry seasons, as we're in right now. We're starting to see already our winters are wet and our summers are drier than they used to be. Sea level rise continues to be an issue, not just for the coastal communities, but for inland, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. The coastal erosion and the impacts associated with the loss of our beaches and beach erosion and the impacts to our coral reef systems, as well as pressure on the natural systems. The exposure and the risk is really interesting. When you look at some of these photographs, you see the drought in Lake Okeechobee. You see where the lake has dried up behind the pumping station. It's just remarkable how it changed. And then you see the exact opposite in Pensacola in 2014, April last year. Look at the water just from rains. And then, of course, days after Superstorm Sandy had passed Florida's coast, obviously not landing here, State Road A1A fell into the ocean. A half-a-mile section of it, the main evacuation route on the barrier island, fell into the ocean and cost the Florida Department of Transportation a little over $20 million to repair. And then the other photograph of Palm Beach County. Again, when we think that the issues of climate change are coastal related, you have only to look at this picture in Palm Beach County taken last year. This is probably 30 to 35 miles inland. They had two 1 in 1,000-year storm events last year that created ponding inside. This water stood standing that far inland for 2 weeks in Palm Beach County because they couldn't drain the water away. And one of the reasons that we know that that's happening is our system is gravity fed, and as sea level continues to rise, it creates a very sluggish drainage system and has all kinds of pressures on us as a result of that. So the economics of climate change, it's an interesting number when you start looking at some of the nationwide numbers. Current climate impacts generated about 1 billion losses in 2012. And there's expectation that in the next 15 years that we can expect the annual cost of those storms to be averaging $35 billion. Florida is also the one likeliest to face the greatest losses to our coastal properties from storms and tides, as well as the public health threats that are associated from extreme heat, as well as extensive critical infrastructure which sits at very low elevations. So it's not just our coastal areas, but roads, railways, ports, airports, and our oil and gas facilities. Here in Broward County alone, our Port Everglades takes in the fuel that supplies 13 counties, 3 international airports, and the Homestead Air Force Base. So again, impacts that may not be exactly hitting on the interior parts of our county or other counties, but certainly compromises in Broward affect other counties as well. Florida is projected to have about $101 billion in property that falls below the mean sea level in the year 2030. So we're not looking that too far out. Predictions of future losses and economic exposures from the 2014 Risky Business Report provided a comprehensive analysis of the economic exposure that climate impacts are expected to generate, not just across our state, but regions and, of course, the nation. It was quite impressive to read this report and see the detailing of the exposure that Florida faces. Often we see these numbers, but we don't see how they ripple out over time as businesses are impacted by storms and can't open at the time that they would normally have been able to. So one of the coolest things about being a county commissioner was getting appointed to President Obama's task force for climate preparedness and resilience. We are often asked as local governments to weigh in on policies once the feds have adopted a chance to be there and be a part of the decision-making process right from the get-go. There's an expression that says if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And I have to share that it was an absolute pleasure to be at the table and also to be co-chairing one of the committees, which was the built environment. Built systems was but one of the areas in which the task force was divided. The other 3 were human health and community development, disaster recovery and resilience, and natural resources in agriculture. You can see on the screen many of the ways in which the task force delved into the broad range of issues facing governments across the country. And probably one of the most important drivers was the idea that we are already spending money. The federal government is spending money, local and state governments are spending money. So a lot of the conversation was about how can we better use the dollars that we have now? How can we and shouldn't we be coming together as regions to share our resources so that we can become more resilient? There was also strong emphasis on the joint consideration of climate mitigation and adaptation as a part of the federal program operations, including the regulations, planning, and, of course, investments. One of those would be a link between transportation and land use decisions, for example, or in energy and water, the natural systems as carbon sinks and buffers to the impacts. When we talked about building resilient communities, we know that it also starts with smart land use and development decisions, and that there are incentives that need to be put in place so that new construction is going to be looking at future conditions, not at the conditions that they currently have now. Broward County and the 3 compact counties adopted, and the state of Florida actually adopted adaptation action areas several years ago and put it into state law. Broward County recently used our comp plan to designate the very first adaptation action areas. These are areas that we're going to decide when projects are coming forth in those areas are going to need an extra look by local governments in order to make sure that we're building for future conditions and not just now. And increasingly, you're seeing federal agencies that are looking for these types of demonstrations of proactive means to ensure that the dollars that they spend in our communities are well spent. They're not just going to be spent for projects of today, but they're going to make the projects that are still there tomorrow make sense. And this means that there's a lot of investments that are needed in our communities that they're not necessarily new or novel. In fact, we have a history as a state and as local communities in undertaking proactive planning and investments, which we know we need to protect our communities and, of course, our natural resources. Planning for climate resilience is really the job that we all have to come together on, knowing that we need to fortify our efforts and work together to solve these problems in a coordinated effort means that we can't just do it alone. We need our federal partners, we need the stakeholders, we need the business community, and we need to certainly not think of our own borders. We need to think broader and geographically. So when we start to look at what are those areas that we need to improve, we know, of course, that we've got to prioritize and promote the use of green and natural infrastructure. The state of Florida has a strong history of lands protection, and you saw that recently in the passage of Amendment 1. Statewide, the average was more than 75% voter approval, and that is that active land acquisition and restoration initiatives have been a long part of what our state holds valuable, and many counties and cities have made significant investments both at their levels in integrating wetlands into the urban landscape and also to improve stormwater treatment areas, as well as preserving green space and flood protection and aquifer recharge. Maintaining important natural systems serve as the buffers to the impacts of storms and flooding. Green and natural infrastructure is also increasingly recognized to play an important and prudent approach to protecting our communities, whether we're enhancing protection from floods or coastal erosion, storm surge, or even looking at our water quality and quantity. Natural systems are recognized for both their intrinsic and economic values. They can't be underplayed. The support and incentivizing climate resilient water resource planning is probably one of the most important directions that we can be taking now, looking at where we're vulnerable, particularly when it comes to our potable water supply, how much of it we have, what we're doing with it after we use it, and understanding that there's only so many straws that can go into our porous limestone and pull those waters up without some sort of consequences. We know, too, that diversifying our sources as far as water conservation, stormwater reuse, and formal integration of climate change in water supply planning is an important part of our resiliency. We can't just look at today. We have to look into the future. And on the state level, we've seen some really interesting diversification of water resources and the heightening of conservation requirements that are becoming increasingly prominent in water supply planning activities. And you'll see in the upper right-hand corner the stormwater storage and reuse. This is a project where, for some unknown reason, there are lands up in Palm Beach County that will actually hold water, and there are projects now in collaboration between Broward County and Palm Beach County to try to find ways to store water and have it available to us in the future. These are very expensive projects, and their costs come into focus when the counties join together to see what we can do to defray the cost not just for one county but across the region. Communities are also working proactively by ensuring that the impacts of climate change are considered as they address their water supply plans and future investments that focus on alternative water supplies and source water diversification. For those that are just getting started, there's a guidance document that was developed to support planning in Southeast Florida, and this provides a good model on how to integrate climate change and impacts of sea level rise in the 10-year water supply plan documents, which are required by the state, as well as how to reflect these planning efforts within our comprehensive plans. Supporting climate resilience as a part of coastal infrastructure planning investments is also key to our ability to be resilient. And it isn't just the three things that you see on the screen. If you just look below, you'll see in Brevard County their beach renourishment project that took them from a very, very narrow beach to a wider beach, and the amount of protection that they have as a result of that. Shoreline protection is undoubtedly going to be an area of increasing need and investment, and the federal government is recognizing the need for a more holistic approach to long-term planning for community resiliency, and regional sediment management is becoming a much more popular theme. We hope that it becomes popular with the dollars that are attendant to these projects. But there's also a greater need for assistance by our federal agency partners in assessing the overall coastal risk as a basis for management strategies. Some of the preferred approaches are likely to reflect a combination of improved sediment management, such as sand bypass projects, and the beneficial use of dredged materials, beach renourishment, and living shorelines features. As we know that those shorelines that have dunes, for example, are much more resilient to protecting inland areas from the actions of the waves. But it isn't just our coast. When we look at the watershed management, this is also an important step in making sure that there's water for all of those communities, not just the coastal areas. And there's a lot of examples of successful leadership in the state in this area, and it underscores the importance of maintaining this focus both for the comprehensive and integrated approaches to water resource protection, especially as the sources are increasingly constrained and populations continue to grow. As we know, water does not recognize jurisdiction boundaries, and with an urban and natural systems dependent on both the high quality and abundant water supplies, integrated approaches to water resource management are going to become increasingly a necessity. The state's leadership in Everglades restoration serves as a model for this type of approach for projects of all scales and continues to be one of the most critical investments being made to support natural system restoration and community resilience in our state. As we always like to say, we need to fight water with water, and the more that we can make sure that freshwater head is flowing southward, it continues to push against the saltwater intrusion that we know is advancing ever inland. Building on some of these tenets comes the knowledge that we have to foster and support each other in the different efforts that we're taking. There is no one model that's going to be the best model. Broward County and our sister counties through the Southeast Florida Climate Compact have made some amazing advances in this area, and I'm proud that we have done the work that we have and been able to move so far forward over the last 6 years. The truth is we couldn't have done it alone. We couldn't have done it without our federal partners. We couldn't have done it if we didn't have each other. It's been an amazing process to be part of it, especially watching communities who started out with kind of a crooked eye when we looked at each other. There wasn't a lot of trust to get to where we are to now, where we're sharing resources. And our model, we think, is one of community action coming together across political lines, across geographical lines, across the economics of the region, and understanding that we found a way to move forward, but that doesn't mean that, as I said earlier, we're the only ones. You're going to hear soon from Margo Moehring in the Northeast Florida Planning Council, where another model is taking shape, and I'm really excited about the work that they are doing up there and eager to hear her presentation today. Some of the key opportunities that are still before us in 2015, as I mentioned earlier, the Amendment 1 Florida Land and Water Conservation Initiative comes with a lot of dollars, estimated to be more than $700 million in this next year, and it's a 20-year change to our Constitution. There's a lot of ways in which these dollars are being discussed and how they can be used in Tallahassee right now. And one of the things that I think is most important, certainly as a state legislator, is to think that we need to take those dollars and kind of have an overriding question, I guess an overlaying principle, and that is, how and where are we vulnerable in this state? What are the areas in which we need to take those dollars and leverage them with the dollars that the state is going to be spending? Whether, if we're buying land, should we be looking at the other ways in which that land is going to help the state become more resilient, whether it's a coastal community or an inland community. All of us are going to be facing a lot of changes, as we've talked through these slides, in our state in the future. We have the longest coastline in the continental United States. We are vulnerable. Our water supply is vulnerable. Our beaches are vulnerable, and so too, as a virtue of that, our economy. And very important that we take a longer view, in my opinion, when we're using and when we're trying to think about the best ways to use Amendment 1 dollars. I would encourage anyone who has thoughts along these lines to reach out to me. I'm very interested in knowing what you think we should be doing with these Amendment 1 dollars. Many think that they were put in place by the voters, and some voters may think that the dollars were solely set aside for land purchases, but if you look at the language of Amendment 1, it clearly allows for a much broader use of those dollars. And as Speaker Crisafulli told me just last week in a meeting with him, this is an opportunity for the state to hit the reset button and really take a holistic look about what our needs are, and I'm hoping that you will help join me in communicating what those needs are, because I have a sense that Tallahassee isn't quite aware of all of our thoughts in that, your help in that. So there's, outside of Amendment 1, there are several key state programs that opportunities exist for land management, water conservation, water protection, sustainability, and program funding for beach management. There are a lot of partners and resources that are represented within our own state agencies. So we want to make sure, as we opened with this presentation, that the federal dollars were appropriately used when they're asking those of us in state and local governments to leverage their dollars. We as a state need to be doing the same thing as local communities put their hands out for these dollars, to make sure that you can demonstrate that you are leveraging them, those dollars. When we do that, when you are able to demonstrate that, both on the federal side and on the local side, we know that that's going to make these dollars go that much farther, and that's going to enhance your ability to draw down grants and other resources as they become necessary. And so with that, we have two more presentations. This is one perspective that I've shared with you, and really looking forward to the opportunity to hear from the other presenters. And I thank you all for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Representative Jacobs. So I'm going to turn the presentation over now to Margo Moehring of the Northeast Florida Regional Council. And so I'm going to stop showing the screen and unmute Margo and switch to her. Margo, don't forget to hit show my screen. That's what I did not do, and that was why we had no slides for a little while.
Okay, is my screen showing?
It is.
Great. Okay, well, thank you very much, Jason and Representative Jacobs. I think that Northeast Florida was invited to participate in the webinar because we may have things in common with other parts of the state that aren't necessarily like Southeast Florida. For one thing, we're a very conservative region. We're not a region that is sort of regularly engaged in discussion on climate change. And one of the reasons for that is that we're not impacted to the extent that we can't ignore it yet. Although for years our farmers have had issues with saltwater intrusion and homeowners on the coast have had erosion issues, it's still not so widely felt that it's a day-to-day conversation kind of issue. And then finally, we have no specific or grant funding associated with working on sea level rise or climate change, but our work reflects the policy priorities of the Northeast Florida Regional Council. So we may be just like you in other communities in Northeast Florida, in Florida. This is a kind of an overview of Northeast Florida. We're 7 counties and 27 municipalities. You might notice that 27 municipalities is a sort of manageable number in that, you know, some other regions have far more. We tend to be a pretty collegial and collaborative region that is pretty comfortable with the idea of regionalism. Not that there aren't occasionally glitches, but we do work together pretty well. We have about 1.5 million people. We have about 8% of all business sales in Florida, and that's just looking at small businesses. We have 2 Navy bases, 2 deep water ports, and historic sites. So we're of some significance. And how we work may be how we're slightly different from other parts of the state. We, as I said, we represent those 7 counties that were just on my previous slide. I think the thing that has proven to be a kind of game changer for us in working on sea level rise and to some extent climate change is in 2006, the Regional Council created a Regional Leadership Academy. And they recruited from the private sector, from the nonprofit sector, as well as from government. And the idea was that once you do this, it tends to be a 7-month sort of study course in all 7 counties and learn about the region and the issues that are facing the region. You graduate and you become a member of a nonprofit that we use as a policy think tank. We call it the Regional Community Institute. So the benefit of those folks who by definition are extremely diverse, they're from throughout the region and they represent all different sort of sectors and stakeholders within the region, they then take on a policy role. They achieved sort of critical mass in 2008. There were about 100 graduates by 2008. And they were asked to do, and they're volunteers. These folks have graduated from this leadership academy, but then it's up to them whether they're willing to work with us on the issues that they're passionate about. The first thing they did was they worked on First Coast Vision, which was a 50-year vision for growth and development in the 7-county region. And that informed our strategic regional policy plan, which all regional councils are required to have. I can tell you that it made our strategic regional policy plan far more valuable and has much more buy-in than it previously did. One of the action items from the vision was climate change, and it essentially said, if we're vulnerable to climate change, make recommendations on what we should do about it. So what the Regional Council did was it put out a call for input on climate change. It basically said, Northeast Florida, tell us what you think. And they left that call open for about 6 months, and at the end of 6 months, what had come in was overwhelmingly sea level rise, was the concern of most of the folks in Northeast Florida. So for that reason, what we worked on was a regional action plan for sea level rise, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. Just to give you an idea, the next issue area that they took up was thriving small business, looking at regional gaps that can be filled and helpful to small business. And this model has worked now 3 separate times. They've had 3 separate policy assignments, and each was proposed by the Board of Directors of the Regional Community Institute, RCI, and then was adopted as regional council policy without change. So these two organizations respect each other very much, and the Regional Council has, without changing them, adopted the recommendations of the Regional Community Institute. So this is the motion that the Regional Council made in August of 2012, requesting that the policy work be done for the next year by the Regional Community Institute. And there's some kind of important, you notice they were very specific in what they wanted the Institute to do. They asked for their consideration. They did not assume that the region was vulnerable. They asked that specific question, are we vulnerable? They were asked to determine working assumptions for level of rise and planning time frame. They were asked to assist local governments in assessing their resiliency. And they were asked to recommend regional strategies if they believe it appropriate. And they were asked to do it in a year. Basically, they looked at, I guess what everybody looks at, the various assumptions for scenarios for sea level rise. And they looked at what the Southeast Florida Climate Compact had looked at in much more, in a way they sort of deferred to that work that had been done several years before and said, well, those guys studied it a lot. We had a presentation from the U.S. Army Corps, and they came away saying we should look at U.S. Army Corps intermediate and high for the present to 2060, and the same for also intermediate and high for 2110. So those were the time frames, and those were the levels that they looked at. And so the first thing they had to decide was, were we vulnerable? Their answer was yes. They decided as working assumptions to use from 1 to 3 feet by 2060, and that's because we have a national estuarine research reserve in our area that was doing very robust work in the Matanzas Basin, and they were finding that 3 foot was the important level where things really started to change. So they decided to use 1 to 3 foot by 2060 and 3 to 6 by 2110. We always say that the probability of 6 feet is low, it's worst case. And we simply used the most simple NOAA bathtub coverage. So it's the same coverage that's available to everybody from NOAA. And we always said we're just starting the conversation. You can't really necessarily plan for a specific site based on this coverage, but you can get the dialogue started. So using that data, which wasn't particularly new, we did maps for 9 communities in Northeast Florida, and that includes communities on the St. Johns River, which are also impacted, as well as coastal communities. We asked them to identify the assets they thought were important and put the NOAA coverage of 1 foot, 3 foot, and 6 foot on a map with the community assets that they wanted to see. And we sat down with community staff mostly. Some of the meetings were public, most were not, simply to assess their resiliency and talk about it. And the input from those meetings was very important in the policy recommendations that came after. So here are some examples of what it looks like in Northeast Florida. We did a series of these maps based on the various resources of regional significance that are included in our plan. This one is economic development. You won't be able to see really the details, but what you're looking at is 1 foot, 3 foot, and 6 foot. And the largest employer in each county, as well as the 5 largest employers in Northeast Florida. Here's national monuments. We are lucky enough to have some fabulous historical monuments. The city of St. Augustine obviously is of huge historic importance, and Castillo de San Marcos is vulnerable, and so it's not the only one, but that's one of the things that we're concerned about. And then transportation, we have ports that are very, very important to our economy, and so these maps show that the importance of ports taking sea level rise seriously. So The approach that the Regional Community Institute has taken is something that they came up with themselves. We at the Regional Council provide staff to them, but there are board of directors and committees of volunteers who are either graduates of the leadership program or people that are invited to participate. They came up themselves with the idea that their plans were always going to be doable. So far at least, they've done 2 regional action plans, the one on sea level rise, the other on thriving small business. In each case, that you won't find anything that says the federal government should do this or the state should fund this. If they can't do it themselves, it's not in the plan. So, for example, the sea level rise action plan is 9 pages long. It's not very long. But it does reflect the things that they can deliver. Learning from others is a nice way of saying that they totally rip off work that other folks have done. I mean, you know, we pay so much attention to what other people have done, especially if they've done really robust work. We don't try to recreate that wheel. It's sort of consistent with the idea that we're simply looking at the NOAA bathtub model. That's okay because we're just getting started. We look at things, as I said, that can be accomplished at the regional level, and throughout everything that they're doing, they're using partnerships and volunteers, and they don't have any special funding. So an action item may not make it to the plan. If it requires funding and there's no reason to think funding is going to be forthcoming, it may not make it. Their strategies, if you could characterize them, they certainly will align with emerging state and federal initiatives, but implementation is not going to wait for those initiatives. I think as a region, we don't perhaps like being told what to do, so we like to kind of take the reins, and I think this is an instance of Northeast Florida doing that. So these are the headings, if you will, on the Regional Action Plan on Sea Level Rise. Creating a clearinghouse on understanding risk, so not creating any new data, there's lots of data out there, but simply characterizing it for the purpose that it's best used for and providing links to it, simple as that. Engaging the community, there's a lot of very creative ideas about ways to engage the community, some of which are already underway and some of which are waiting on leadership of the business community, which I'll talk about in a moment. There's a whole section called Save Money, which it focuses on 2 things. One, under the National Flood Insurance Program, the community rating system, having all of our local governments sort of maximize the value of that. And we actually have a CRS users group that is focusing on that on a regional perspective. And also infrastructure cost benefit, NOAA's how much will adaptation cost? That methodology that was developed by NOAA needs to be made regional in order to be used, but the methodology already exists, so they strongly support that. And that is something we expect to be able to use relatively shortly. Collaboration, leveraging success, recognizing what people are already doing, and you know, capitalizing on it. And then I think most interestingly for the folks who are on this webinar is engaging the business sector in long-term resiliency. So it's all about collaboration, especially when you don't have any money, right? You all know this. It's all about collaboration. So during the entire period of the, it's the Guana, Talamato, Matanzas, NER, and they worked with the University of Florida on the study on Matanzas Space, and we were on the steering committee of that work, and they were on the steering committee of our work to make sure that we were sharing data and, you know, making sure that the message was always the same to the public and that we were clear. The North Florida Land Trust has done really interesting work on ecosystem values. They're about acquisition of conservation areas and have been looking at sea level rise because obviously you don't want to buy land that's going to be inundated. You know, you really need to be thinking much more creatively and understand much better before you buy land now. So they shared that information with us at some of the best available data we have. We're working specifically with local governments on resiliency to flooding through the CRS system. So we do joint meetings where we talk with the floodplain manager, talks about what they would ordinarily talk about in doing sort of public engagement to make sure people understand their flooding risk and build accordingly. And then we, at those same meetings, many of which have been happening at chambers of commerce, we talk about sea level rise. And then one of the specific recommendations, and it is in fact the most specific recommendation in the Regional Action Plan, is that there should be something called the Public-Private Regional Resiliency Committee, which we affectionately call P2R2. And it has a kind of little funny icon that looks a little bit like a robot. They have a sense of humor, let's put it that way. So the Regional Action Plan identifies who should be on that committee, and you'll see the list there. At a minimum, a developer, a banker, a lawyer, a risk manager, the regional chamber, an economist, a representative of the Urban Land Institute, a realtor, and then representatives of county municipal government, the regional council itself, and the Regional Community Institute. It took about 6 months to recruit the right people, if you will. Our kind of working model was that they needed to be thought leaders, people that other people would follow, their communities would follow. They were already leaders, but they weren't necessarily leaders that were all about adaptation to climate change. They were folks that were smart and interested and willing to listen, but not necessarily already kind of on board. We thought there was more value in, beginning, in them all sort of beginning at the same place. And why they're engaged, and of course this is me interpreting why I think they're engaged, but they started working last June. They're still engaged, and what they're saying is the reason that they're engaged, because they believe resiliency is good business, which probably isn't very hard to understand, but they also think it's good marketing. So if we're a region that is able to talk about our resiliency plans and why it's okay, we understand we have vulnerable areas and here's what we're going to do about it. Now I can't tell you what they're going to say yet, but they're developing a strategy that we expect them to launch pretty shortly. And they meet regularly, and they haven't, as I said earlier, they haven't run screaming. So this was one of the things that we showed them at their first meeting, just to give them kind of an idea of why they should care. And it's just the best data that we had at the time. So we looked at storm surge, assuming a Category 5. So that's inclusive of Categories 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And that it shows that 31% of the parcels in the area, and it shows, you can read it for yourself. So there's a big impact there. And then discretely and not included within storm surge, we showed them using the NOAA bathtub data, the number of parcels and the acreage and the value that would be impacted by 1 foot, 3 foot, and 6 foot of sea level rise. So that's kind of where they began, and those metrics are something that they intend to sort of follow through. So over time, one of the ways they'll be able to measure kind of how we're doing as a region, whether we are, being successful in becoming more resilient, is whether those numbers change. To be specific, they are, as you know, they're an action item from the Regional Action Plan. They are a committee of the Northeast Florida Regional Council. It was determined when the work was being done on the Regional Action Plan very early that business leadership is most likely to succeed in Northeast Florida. That may not be the case in every area, but it's pretty, you can almost say it's pretty much the case in most areas. So if the business, we have a very engaged business community. If they see an issue as being important, government will see it as being important as well. But it works better to have the business community kind of understand it and recognize its significance first. And so the committee is on track to launch a strategy in June 2015. They were initially asked to look at a strategy that incentivized development and investment from going into vulnerable areas, it's likely that they'll go beyond that and look, kind of more globally at what's going on. But that at this point, as far as what they're going to recommend, all I can say is stay tuned. So as far as issues in our region, just things to be aware of, the St. Johns River is very impacted by sea level rise. So if you look at this image is the transportation facilities map that just shows 1 foot, and 1 foot extends way down into Putnam County and Flagler County. So that's something that probably we need some pretty robust study at some point on what that's going to mean for the salinity of the river, for the overall health of the river and its ecosystem. There's a lot there. We have assets on the coast like everyone else, so that's an issue. The slide I showed before that looked at valuation had best available data for storm surge discretely from best available data for sea level rise. So those haven't been looked at in combination, and that will change things. And just business leadership remains an issue in our region and is kind of something that is overarchingly important in Northeast Florida. And here are a series of links. The Regional Action Plan is on the Regional Council's website at nefrc.org. Has a web page that has all the documents that they've been looking at, and my email is there if you'd like to contact me. So with that, I look forward to questions later in the webinar.
Thanks very much, Margo. Really appreciate your presentation. And now I'm going to switch it over to, just in a moment here, to Josh Sawislak with the Council on Environmental Quality. Just give me one moment here. All right, there we go. And Josh, you are unmuted. Are you there?
I am here. Thank you, Jason. And thank you to the Compact for inviting me to join you today. I really enjoyed Representative Jacobs and Margo's presentation. And let's see, can we actually go back to the first slide? Let me start there. So on behalf of the White House, let me thank all of you for participating in this webinar, because as I'll discuss today, the only way we will make this nation more resilient to climate change is with action at local level. We understand in Washington, and we understand that we are not always the key to getting things done on the ground. And the key part of the President's Climate Action Plan is to support the work of states, local governments, tribes, and the private sector in preparing for these impacts. As both of the other panelists discussed, this is a critical time for Florida as it is for the nation and the world. Next slide. What I'd like to briefly cover this afternoon are these 3 questions. What does it mean to adapt to climate change? What do decision makers need to do, and what is the federal government doing? But let me start with a little bit of background on climate change itself. Next slide. Well, the President's been very clear that the debate is over. We've stopped arguing about whether climate change is happening. If someone wants to believe that we humans are not causing climate change, go ahead. Personally, I'm going to stay with the room full of Nobel laureates who think that it is. So as the President said the other night, I'm not a scientist, but I know a lot of really smart ones, and some of them are on this call today, and they're really very clear with us that these things are happening. We can measure the impact. We can measure that climate change is actually happening. And the most recent piece of information we got was that 2014 was the hottest year on record. And it's not just, Dr. Holgren, the President's science advisor, likes to say that one data point doesn't make a trend, but when you look at, all of the data in the last 10, 20, 30 years, it's very clear that these things are happening, and when you look at CO2 levels, there's a straight correlation between them, so we can, I think, pass along on the argument about what's happening here, but let's actually focus on what we do about it. Next slide. So the moniker global warming, which is one that we used in the past, we try not to use anymore, I think it caused a lot of people to think that this was just about things getting a little hotter in the summer. But we need people to understand the full range of issues caused by climate change. It's not just the heat, but it's also more frequent and more severe storms, sea level rise, and the things that are caused by these things like flooding, drought, and all of the environmental, social, and economic impacts that are caused by these changes. It's a cascading effect. And when we talk about changes in temperature, the other thing that's really important for people to understand is that, you know, you've probably heard people talk about a 1 degree or a 2 degree change in average temperature. That's the average temperature. It's not the limit. So you could have a much higher number that is the hottest point or the coldest point. That number of 2 degrees is an average. And the other thing that it causes is changes in ocean temperature. And this is a really big deal because it affects glacial ice. And we're starting to see huge impacts from that. And what that does is it affects sea level rise. And now we get into the effects of sea level rise. It also affects acidification in the ocean. And all of these things together cause us to have to adapt to these impacts. Let's go to the next slide, please. So let me get in with adaptation. And what we're more often hearing people talk about these days, which is resilience. And adaptation and mitigation were terms that we used to talk about the causes of climate change and the impacts of climate change. And I think it was a little confusing for people. So I think resilience is one that we're hearing a lot more to talk about the preparing for and dealing with the impacts of climate change. And what we're really talking about here is risk management. So when you look at a risk, you basically have three choices. You can avoid that risk, and in some cases that means that you build something in a different place, or you don't build something, or you build it to a different standard. You can transfer that risk, and that's usually done through insurance or other ways where you're basically saying, I understand that I still have this risk, it could happen, my house could burn down, but I'm insured against that, and so I've transferred that risk to someone else. And the third option is that you can accept the risk. But those are really the only three options. There are no other choices. You can't bury your head in the sand and ignore the risk. Because if you do that, you've accepted it. You've said, I'm going to not talk about it, but I'm going to accept that risk. And I'm going to say, I can handle if it happens. And when you do it that way, when you ignore the risk, you've done it in the worst possible way because you haven't made an intelligent decision about whether you want to avoid the risk, transfer the risk, or accept the risk. And let me be very clear, there are a whole lot of risks that we are all going to accept. We get in our cars every day and drive, or we walk down the street. And we're accepting the risk that something could happen. But the choice is that we stay holed up in our house and we never do anything, and that's an unacceptable choice. So we accept that risk. But we might do things that we avoid some risks. We wear a seatbelt. We cross in the crosswalk. These are things that we do to avoid certain risks. Or we have health insurance. We get hit by a bus and, we have to go to the hospital. Or we trip and fall. So we do all of these things every day, and what we're suggesting we do with climate change is we take that same approach. Really, it's good planning, and I always like doing presentations with other planners, and when they were going through the introductions. Margo and I are both professional planners, so it's great to have that kind of basis of thinking, what do you want to do, and let's look at this from the larger picture. So part of good planning is land use, which is really a local issue. It's not a national issue. Building codes, also a local issue. So what we're asking people essentially to do in this is to do good planning and look forward and not backward. And what we mean by that, by looking forward, is look at what's going to happen during the useful life of the thing that you're investing in, whether that's your house, it's a school, it's a civic building, a business, or a wastewater treatment plant. Each of those things has a different useful life. Some of them are short. You buy a car, the useful life may be 10 years. If you build a road or a bridge, it might be 50 or 100 years. And so you have to look at that and look forward as to what those risks are instead of looking back. Because if you just look at what happened in the past, then you ignore the fact that things are changing. Next slide, please. There we go. So I said that land use planning and building code are local issues. So what's the federal role? And what we see the federal role in this is really helping with the climate science. And I'll talk a little bit about the National Climate Assessment, some of the technical assistance, and some of the tools that we're developing for decision makers. But the real, I think, important piece of the federal role is leadership. And we have to lead by example. We have to look at how we're spending your money through tax dollars on federal facilities, but also on federally sponsored projects, all of those federal investments. So we have to look at each one of those and say, are we spending your money effectively? Are we protecting your investment from the future impacts of climate change? And so you're going to see over the next couple of weeks, as we roll out the budget, and the President talked a little bit about this in the State of the Union, and through some other actions, that we are looking at how we can take federal leadership in this area. Next slide, please. Okay, so what are we actually doing on the federal side right now? The President issued his Climate Action Plan. It'll be 2 years this summer. And there are 3 major pillars to that Climate Action Plan. And the first one focuses on reducing carbon emissions and addressing the causes of climate change. And the third pillar, and I'll come back to the second in a minute, but the third pillar is taking a leadership role internationally. There's a lot of things that we've been doing internationally. But what I want to talk about here is the second pillar, which is preparing the nation for the impacts of climate change. And the President issued an executive order. For those of you who want to look it up, it's Executive Order 13653. And what that executive order did is it created an interagency climate change council. And this is basically a way in which we can get all of the federal agencies together in a room and talk about what we're doing individually and how we work those things together. But we realized that much of what we need to do is support state, local, and tribal governments. So the President, as part of that executive order, set up the task force that Representative Jacobs is a member of, and included governors from across the country, mayors, county commissioners, and tribal leaders. And I had a great honor of working with that task force both in my previous role and now at the White House. And Representative Jacobs said it was very cool to be on the task force. And from our side, it was actually very cool to have her and her colleagues helping us understand the boots on the ground issues and problems, and what we as the federal government can do to clear a path for great local leaders such as Representative Jacobs, and all of the members of that task force. Because in the end, the real fight on this is going to happen in each one of your communities, because this is a lot about local decisions and local land use. We have to ensure that the federal investment is done effectively, but we also we have to give you the tools to make those decisions. So each of the agencies is developing what are called agency adaptation plans, which is they're looking at their own programs and their own assets and looking at how they can ensure that they are prepared for the impacts of climate change. Those plans are available on the agency's websites. If you, I'm not going to give you the whole list of website addresses here, but if you go to either the agency site or just Google agency adaptation plan and the name of the agency, you can probably find it. Let me go to the next slide and talk a little bit about the overall principles. The easiest way, and this is kind of basic planning, for us to look at how we do adaptation is the first and most important thing is to understand your risks. And what I have seen happening in Florida and around the country is communities, states, local governments, regional governments and organizations looking at what that risk that they are facing is. Before they make a decision about that risk management, they have to understand the risks. And you have to be able to explain those risks, not just in terms of what's going to happen in 2050 or 2100, but what's happening today. You know, we all have a lot of demands on our time and our financial resources. And when we think about, I got to get my kids to school, I got to pay the rent, I got to do all these things, why am I thinking about something that's not going to happen until 2100? The reality of climate change is it's affecting you today. It's affecting you financially. It's affecting you and your children from a health perspective, things like increases in asthma in children, changes in migratory patterns for birds and wildlife, changes in crop yield, changes in everything from mosquitoes to all sorts of other things, what we call vectors, that may either bring disease or change how those diseases are spread. You have to prioritize, and that's an important piece of, you know, you're going to identify risks, and there are going to be more risks than you can address. And part of making those decisions about which ones you avoid and which ones you transfer and which ones you accept is that prioritization. You also have to engage other stakeholders, both public and private. And what was great in both presentations today is that discussion of working across with other communities and working with the private sector. You really need to take a systems approach when you do this. And I think that's a really important piece of this because of the interdependency of all these things. During Hurricane Sandy in the Northeast, there were about 11 billion gallons of raw and partially treated sewage that were released from wastewater treatment plants in New York, New Jersey. Now, most of that was actually not from damage to the plants, but from the fact that the plants lost power. If the plants had had some sort of resilient power, whether that was on-site generation or microgrids or some other approach, then a lot of that release of sewage would not have happened. And really looking at those dependencies, there's a whole lot of other examples of them. But what that allows you to do is kind of maximize benefits by looking at how we can improve a whole number of things by making one system more resilient. And because it's going to have a cascading effect, either good or bad. And then finally, you need to evaluate what you did and adjust as necessary. Lots of things change. We can't predict the future perfectly, but we can make some good assumptions about it. And over time, as we see things happening, we can go back and tweak, and we can say, okay, this strategy didn't work as well as we wanted it to. Let's try something different. Or this assumption wasn't correct, and something else has happened. So let's adjust our strategy based on changes in the assumption. Next slide, please. Let me talk for a second about disaster preparedness and infrastructure. We've gotten really good at response to disasters in this country. And I think, after Katrina, we realized that the federal government couldn't just come in, right in, and save the day entirely. It was going to take a whole of nation response. Everybody had to work together. And so we developed a national response framework that looked at the roles of both the federal government, state and local government, the private sector, community organizations, churches and volunteer organizations, and all sorts of stuff. And we've gotten pretty good at it. But the problem with disaster, with looking at this from a disaster perspective, is it's a losing hand. We've already waited until the bad thing has happened before we deal with it. And it's going to cost a lot more, and it's going to have a lot more long-lasting impacts, especially in areas that have significant economic ties to tourism. I was just in Hawaii. This is a huge issue for Hawaii. They had a hurricane in Kauai, Hurricane Iniki, did massive damage to the tourist areas in Kauai. Kauai is a smaller portion of their tourist revenue than in Honolulu and Waikiki. If that same thing had happened in Waikiki, they would have lost 40% of their tourist revenue. It would have been crippling to the state. And so we have to look at what the risk is there and how we can, what we in the disaster business call left of boom before the disaster, start looking at investing in that mitigation before the disaster happens. And one of the interesting things that when we look at the data on this, those investments have about a 4-to-1 return on investment. So every dollar that you spend before the disaster is worth 4 times as much as the dollar you spend after the disaster. And so it's just good business sense to do it. Next slide, please. I talked a little bit about climate change and people's health, because this is a today issue. And I think this is really important. It's not just about sea level rise. It's not just about any single issue. Heat waves are a big issue. They have a huge health impact on the elderly and medically vulnerable. And the other things that happens during a disaster is you have reduced services, and whether that's fire, police, medical, these are things that you want to protect against because they have cascading consequences on the community. Food and water safety are really a big issue, and they are significantly affected by climate change. Next slide. So coastal areas are really out front in this fight, and the Atlantic and the Gulf Coast, as well as Alaska and Pacific Islands, are they're really the front of the line. They are seeing the threat before many other areas of the country, but they are not the only place that is actually being threatened, because we're having those threats in the middle of the country in Colorado, along the Mississippi River, all over the country, whether it's drought, it's more severe storms. These things are happening in all these places. Let me skip to the next one. I mentioned the National Climate Assessment. This is a great resource. It was developed by the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which was mandated by Congress, and the National Climate Assessment is one of its core missions. We just released the third National Climate Assessment last year. It has both data and projections by region, and much of these data have been downscaled for local communities, and you need to look to what some of the local government organizations and the universities have done as far as using that information and that data for your specific community. The I think I didn't put the website on here. It's nca2014.globalchange.gov, but if you just Google National Climate Assessment, I think it's the first thing that comes up. And this was developed by a group of 300 top scientists and researchers from across the country, reviewed by federal agencies and a panel from the National Academy of Science. This is really a very, very valuable resource, and it's also one that's unlike some of the technical reports that you see if you look at climate change data. We've done this pretty much all on a website, and so you can get as little or as much of the detail as you want. There are no actual printed copies of the entire 1,200-page, 1,300-page document. There are some printed copies of the summary, but most of it's available on the website, so it's a little easier to use. Next slide, please. This one I actually did give you the website for. So this is a set of tools that we've developed and we are continuing to develop to help local communities look at these issues, understand the issues that they're facing, determine those vulnerabilities, look at ways to mitigate those, evaluate risk and cost, and then hopefully take action on them. And I very strongly hope that you will take a look at this site. I'm not going to go into any detail on it because it's a lot easier if you just visit the site after the webinar and take a look at it. Next slide. Let me touch on the private sector just as a final thing, and Margo talked a lot about this. I think it's really important, most of the infrastructure in the U.S. is actually privately owned. Businesses rely on the public infrastructure just as residents do, and it would take an entire separate webinar or maybe a series of webinars to explore this fully, but there are significant opportunities to bring the private sector into this discussion. And three efforts that we're working on nationally, Build America, which is really looking at public-private partnerships for transportation and other infrastructure. There's a new effort out of the Environmental Protection Agency on water infrastructure, looking at drinking water and wastewater, stormwater management. And the last one is a discussion we've been having with the insurance and reinsurance industry about how we basically develop value, and we capture the value of these investments through the insurance market. And reinsurance, for folks who don't know, these are the people who insure the insurers. And so they really have a vested interest in looking at this holistically. I'll leave you, next slide please, with a quote from the President who summed it up much more concisely than I have, and last week in his State of the Union, basically that this is real, it's happening, and we have to act now. And with that, I will thank you, and I guess we go to questions from here, Jason.
Yes, Josh. Oops, sorry. We're back. We're going to do questions. We've had a couple come in. We had one come in actually before the webinar started. I see a couple hands raised. If you've done that, it's actually probably better if you type your question into the question box. That will allow us to kind of look over the questions and maybe consolidate some of them. But I want to start with one that came in by email before we even started. And by the way, Josh and Margo, I've unmuted both of you as well, so this can be a group response if it is. But the question was basically about from someone who works in a non-coastal community, asking about how concerned non-coastal communities in Florida should be about sea level rise and climate issues. If it's important to have a plan for resilience, and if they should wait, if inland communities should wait until the coastal communities they're adjacent to have developed plans to develop their own. So I don't know, maybe Representative Jacobs, if you want to start to respond to that.
Yeah, the first thing I wanted to say is that you're impacted if you drink water. You're impacted if you have all of your water supply just ducky in your community. The neighboring one may not. And so there may come a day, and we're seeing this in Broward with 28 water utilities and 31 cities, where inland water utilities may have enough capacity, water capacity, wastewater capacity for their citizens or their ratepayers, not the neighboring city. And so as coastal communities start to lose their water supply, they're going to be reaching into other communities. in some counties, for example, you have one county that has the entire population on one utility, so they're able to reach, east or west in order to address their needs. But so just from, and there's myriad other ways, but just from the question about whether you need to be concerned, climate change is not just a coastal issue. And increasingly, the other reason why you should be concerned is that federal and state dollars, even county dollars, are going to start coming with a few strings attached to them. And what they're going to want to know, with so many hands out, which ones are considering future conditions when they're going after grants, which ones are considering future conditions when they're spending their own dollars so that they can make sure they're being wisely spent. These kinds of calculations, if you can't demonstrate that you have had this conversation across your agency and across your community, then ultimately you're going to fall, you're just not going to be able to compete. And so I think for those two reasons and many others, I'm sure my colleagues on the call will want to weigh in. I think it's really important to look at the future conditions and understand your vulnerability, to go through that assessment, understand where your vulnerabilities are, and also understand where your neighboring communities are and where you sit in the region, and then understand how others' lack of preparedness may actually impact you in ways that you had never considered.
Josh or Margo, would you like to, either of you like to respond to that?
I couldn't have said it better.
I'm going to stick with Representative Jacobs. This is a whole.
All right, thank you. Okay, so we had a question coming online about asking how to get involved. I think it was one of the Representative Jacobs' slides about how to get involved with these opportunities that are coming forward in 2015: land and water conservation, water protection, sustainability program initiatives, beach management. Whom should folks contact?
If you're looking at, I'm not sure, if you're looking at ways in which Amendment 1 dollars are going to be used, the input right now, that as much as you can give to me, just it's kristin.jacobs@myfloridahouse.gov. It's an interesting dynamic that's taking place right now. You have the Senate and the House in two different places about the ways in which these dollars should be spent, and the governor unveiled his budget today, and his budget wants to take 1/4 of Amendment 1 dollars and use that for the state's share of obligations for the Everglades and projects within the Everglades. That's an interesting proposal, particularly when you consider that we are all, particularly the large urban communities, giving substantial dollars to the water management districts that are already charged with carrying out those projects. They do not have the funding that they need, but we're already paying now, and now through dock stamps and other dollars we'll be paying yet again for the Everglades. And so how we weigh in, how you all think about it, what your water projects are, what your assessments of your vulnerability, and how the Amendment 1 dollars may assist you, I think that knowledge would be very helpful to me in weighing in on how and which ways these dollars should be spent. Generally speaking, a series of boxes are going to be created by the state for appropriations. These dollars will be divvied up into these boxes, and then at some point there will be discussion about how those dollars should be spent and upon which priorities. None of that is determined now. Not the boxes, not the amount of dollars, nor any sort of priority or criteria. So all of that's information, and the legislature is loose. We have lots of ideas, but I know that you all do too, so your input would be very helpful.
Great. Margo or Josh, anything to add? It seemed like that was a pretty clear question at the representative.
Yeah.
Okay. So another question came in. It sounds like a question everyone can answer. Which coastal city in the U.S. is farthest ahead in planning for sea level rise, climate change, and resiliency?
Well, we think we are. But Josh could probably better answer that question.
Yeah, let me say that there are a lot of folks who are doing different things, and there are probably two groups, the people, maybe three groups, the people who are leaning forward on this, the people who are starting to, and the people who have their head in the sand. I think Representative Jacobs and the team in Southeast Florida is leaning very far forward. It sounds like the folks in Northeast Florida have a good approach and are looking at these. I hope that they will consider some of the other threats beyond just sea level rise. And there are folks in California, on the West Coast, in Hawaii, in Alaska, who see this problem and understand it. There are also folks in inland areas, Colorado, Iowa, and other places, where they understand the great risks that they have from climate change, and they're starting to address those. I'll be quite honest with you, there are other places where they have decided that they can ignore the risk and it will go away. My sense of that is when you do that, you've just accepted the risk in the worst possible way.
Okay. I've got a question about if there's an opportunity to create a repository of climate resiliency best practices around the nation. And Josh, as I understand it, the toolkit and some of the resources available there will be able to serve as that something of a role. Is that correct?
Absolutely, Jason. We're working on that as part of the toolkit and the Climate Data Initiative. There are a number of different things. One of the things, there's a lot of different information at the federal level. Lots of different agencies have been developing tools and data sets and all sorts of other things. We're trying to bring those together, or at least create a front door to it in a way that is more accessible, more understandable to people. But that very question is actually one of the recommendations of the State, Local, and Tribal Task Force. So I will tell you, we are on it.
That's great. And there are some other best practice clearinghouses and so forth out on the internet. I know that are available. CAKE is one. I think it stands for Climate Adaptation and Knowledge Exchange. If you just Google CAKE and climate adaptation, that will probably pop up. And there are a lot of resources available there, and I think there are a number of other sites. Some may be more specific as to particular areas of the country or particular subtopics. I guess this is a question maybe for the representative. Given Florida's acknowledged vulnerability, is Tallahassee more amenable to funding and passing climate change initiatives than the general public realizes?
Well, we haven't started my first session yet, so I'm not sure what the answer to that question is. I will tell you that I have spent the last couple of months trying to get to know all my colleagues and those that are in leadership and the agency staff. And when it comes to the staff, I'm very impressed by the work that they've been doing and their understanding. How that is translating to individual members, I think, is more a reflection of what the communities that they represent are telling them. And in some cases, you have very well-versed representatives who believe that something needs to be done, and those representatives, the ones I'm most familiar with in our conversations, representatives that are talking about these issues and wanting to see that Amendment $1 go to cover more than just buying land, but that we're looking at multiple criteria that helps us become less vulnerable, and I know there's an interest in it. So we'll see what happens in this session. There's a whole lot of things to divert attention from gaming to, just a number of issues. I won't even go into them. They don't relate to this call. But certainly I would encourage you, again, at Kristin.Jacobs at myfloridahouse.org. I would love to, or .gov. I would love to hear from you.
Great. And I think that's going to have to be the end of the questions today, as we are actually going to be kicked out of the conference room we're sitting in currently. But as Representative Jacobs indicated, if you are interested in getting in touch with the panelists, I would be happy to do that. You see my contact information here on the screen. Feel free to email me. There were a couple questions we didn't get to. I will try to reach out individually and respond the best I can to those that have just come into the question window. If you have colleagues who were not able to get on to the webinar today because of the capacity issues we were facing, I want to please extend our apologies to them. We did not realize that there was a cap of 100 participants when we set this our first webinar. That's a mistake we will not be making again. But it certainly was terrific that all of you could join, and we want to thank you for taking the time out of your schedules today. We have recorded this webinar. It will be posted to the Compact's website, which you see listed here at the bottom of the screen. along with the presentations. Give us a week or two to get those up, but they will be available, and we'll see if we can't send out an email to folks once that's happened, to everybody who had originally registered for the call. So once again, I want to thank Josh Sawislak, Margo Moehring, Representative Kristin Jacobs for their participation today, and thank you again for spending some time with us. Thanks very much.